Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to today's official side event to the 7th meeting of the Interim Intergovernmental Steering Group on Cross-Border Paperless Trade Facilitation. My name is Raoul Renard and I am Deputy Director of Legal Reform of the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. Today's panel is titled Toward Globally Harmonized Standards for the Digital Trading System. Our panelists together comprise almost a century of experience in trade facilitation and trade digitalization. Trade digitalization is in full swing across the global economy, reducing transaction costs, facilitating effective participation in global value chains, and enhancing market access and reach. Yet in the process of digital transformation, we run the risk of digital islands, siloed progress, and a splintering of digital trade standards. Today's event will explore digital trade standardization through the work of the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, or DSI, the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, UNCITRAL, and the Interoperability Framework Trade Trust, and will seek to answer the following questions. What digital trade standards already exist and are fit for widespread deployment? What are the legal and regulatory impediments to the use of electronic trade documents? How can states operationalize the digitalization of trade and trade finance processes? How much economic value can be unlocked through the use of digital trade solutions? And what best practices are being developed by early movers? These topics are very much aligned to the Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific, which notes the importance of international standards and guidelines in Article 9, and legal instruments enabling cross-border paperless trade in Article 10. In that connection, I am very pleased to hand the floor to Mr. Jan Duval, Chief Trade Policy and Facilitation Section, UN ESCAP, to provide opening remarks. Mr. Duval, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Raoul. So as you mentioned, this is a side event of the 7th meeting of the Interim Intergovernmental Steering Group on cross-border paperless trade facilitation. So what this body is it's actually the intergovernmental body that negotiated the UN treaty, the only and first UN treaty on accelerating trade digitalization, called the Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. So I think these events fit very well with the work of the steering group. It is very much crucial that international standards and guidelines are applied to ensure interoperability in paperless trade and to develop a safe, secure, and reliable means of communication for the exchange of trade-related data and documents in electronic form. In fact, the framework agreement itself, right, in its Article 9, encourages the development of international standards and best practices related to cross-border paperless trade. We feel that this is a very important article, and in support of its implementation, in fact, we soft-launched yesterday a new version of our cross-border paperless trade database. So you can find this as www.digitalizetrade.org. And that database includes information on ongoing projects on cross-border paperless trade, but it also includes extensive information on relevant legal and technical standards related to digital trading systems and paperless trade in general. So going forward, ESCAP will continue its already close collaboration with the International Chamber of Commerce and the UN Commission on International Trade Law, and in this area and other relevant areas. So I believe it's a very excellent work that is being done by the Digital Standards initiatives of the ICC. Very good work also at the UN CITRAL on developing different model laws that will support paperless trade, and also in Singapore and the Trade Trust. So I look forward very much to hear the latest updates on these initiatives, and I'm sure it will provide insights on what remains to be done on developing harmonized standards for digital trade. So with that, thank you very much, Raoul.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for hosting us. It's great to be here with you. I'd like to now introduce our panelists. With over 14 years' experience in global trade and supply chain, Ms. Hannah Nguyen is a passionate champion for digitalisation and connecting disparate parts of its ecosystem. Her role as Director of Digital Ecosystems at ICC's Digital Standards Initiative is transforming the industry by uniting industry stakeholders, standards development organisations, solution providers, governments and intergovernmental organisations in the common quest to promote policy coherence and harmonise digital trading standards for the benefit of business, governments and people everywhere. A prominent industry advocate and thought leader, she has co-authored with the World Trade Organization its first ever standards toolkit for cross-border paperless trade, helping companies and government agencies globally adopt readily available standards. Her prior experience includes leading business development for C. Steinweg Group that resulted in significant expansions for its commodity logistics business in Southeast Asia, promoting Singapore as the premier regional hub for the trading of commodities and derivatives through Enterprise Singapore, and conducting market intelligence to advise corporates interested in competing and growing their businesses in Asia Pacific. Welcome, Hannah. Mr. Luca Castellani is a legal officer in the Secretariat of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. As Secretary of UNCITRAL Working Group 4 on Electronic Commerce, he oversaw the preparation of the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Transferable Records, or Malita, as well as work on the use and cross-border recognition of identity management and trust services. He has assisted several countries in the enactment of UNCITRAL texts on electronic commerce. He is also active in the field of paperless trade facilitation and has contributed to drafting the Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade in Asia and the Pacific. Welcome, Luca. As Assistant Director of the Trade Division under IMDA's Sectoral Transformation Group, Mr. K. Renyu is responsible for the development of various initiatives to accelerate digital transformation of trade and related sectors in Singapore, as well as fostering industry partnerships in the pursuit of these objectives. Renyu has more than 23 years of professional experience in digital initiatives and projects in the domains of logistics, maritime transport, and trade facilitation. This includes extensive experience in the private sector, undertaking various leadership roles overseeing business development and project implementation portfolios spanning global markets. Before joining IMDA, Renyu was Director of Business Development with Bolero Singapore, signing on their first Singaporean bank for electronic bills of lading. He's also led Crimson Logic's Trade Exchange business development team to drive the digitalisation of Singapore's trade facilitation processes in collaboration with its lead government agency, Singapore Customs. Welcome, Kay. And finally, last but not least, Chris Southworth is Secretary General at the International Chamber of Commerce, United Kingdom, and a regular voice for business in the international media. He's also co-chair of the Legal Reform Advisory Board at the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, Director of the Secretariat for the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Trade and Export Promotion, and ICC representative to the Commonwealth. He is a member of the ICC World Council as well as the International Advisory Boards of the Digital Trade Network and Queen Mary Unidroit Institute of Transnational Commercial Law. Chris is a leading international expert on creating modern digital trade ecosystems, the founder of the ICC Digital Trade Roadmap and ICC G7 United Kingdom representative. He's also a lead independent advisor to the UK government on the digitisation of trade on behalf of industry, working with a range of departments, including the Department for International Trade, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, Her Majesty's Treasury, and the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Welcome, Chris. And with that, I'd like to first turn to Hannah, recalling that the title of this event is Towards Globally Harmonized Standards for the Digital Trading System. Why do we need a globally harmonized and digitalized trading environment?
Hello, sorry. Thank you, Raul, for that question. And again, what a pleasure it is to be here in person in Bangkok. And thanks again to our colleagues at ESCAP for hosting us today. To that question, Raul, I think the title of the event says it all. So we are saying towards a globalized, digitalized trading environment. So we are on that journey. And in my past 10 years embedded in the physical supply chain, what I can say is that for a fact, a large amount of international trade and supply chain are not yet digitalized, or at least they are, but only very partially. And why do I say that? So if you go to the physical supply chain and international trade today, you almost observe two very different worlds. The first world is heavily manual, paper-based processes, where, as you move down the supply chain from the exporter to the freight forwarder to the carrier that carries that goods in containers across the ocean to the other side, looking at customs, the banking process, insurance, and all of that. Every piece of data that passes along that chain exists on a piece of paper. And that piece of data needs to be manually screened, transcribed into usually another system, which exists in a silo, not connected with the rest of the ecosystem. And so in that process, there's a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of time and effort spent on just merely verifying the data, making sure that it's authenticated, that it's reliable for whatever process that you need, whether it's an export-import process, whether it's a cross-border control process, or let's say a trade finance transaction. So that is the first world, which is heavily manual and paper-based. The other part of the world is selectively or partially digitalized. So this is where we have usually large corporations, large financial institutions, and countries which have the means to invest and onboard technology solutions to help solve some of the inefficiencies that I have just described. So it's almost like joining a club where, you got to pay some membership fee, get onboarded into this exclusive club of players. You have a set of rules, terms and conditions that you subscribe to, and among this exclusive set of players, you agree what are the rules of the game in order to play this digitalized trading game, which means among your ecosystem of players, let's say you agree, this is what an electronic bills of lading looks like, this is how I would exchange that with you, and this is how you would agree to receive that and authenticate that. So that's selectively and partially digitalized, because as long as you are part of that club, and usually it's a privileged one, you get to play the game. But outsiders of that club do not get to play. And what does that mean? It means that we end up almost like an ocean with many, many digital islands, where there are so many different clubs that you can join, and you can probably join one or a few of them, but you can't join all of them. So there's disconnected, disparate digital islands which are not talking to one another. So we look at this landscape and we ask ourselves, does it have to be this way? And I think increasingly among government policymakers, circles, and business private sector players, there's an increasing recognition that it doesn't have to be this way. There is an alternative world that we can create, that actually we can have that digital information flow from the supply chain seamlessly exchanged end-to-end in such a way that is efficient, that is cost-effective, that is actually accessible to everyone. So if we talk about the ambitions behind the ICC Digital Standards Initiative is to really accelerate that journey of trade and supply chain digitalization. We want to make that journey a lot more accessible to a much wider array of actors across sectors, across borders, and we want to accelerate that journey a lot faster. So that's the entire reason why the ICC Digital Standards Initiative was set up 18 months ago in 2020, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we recognize this is the time to capitalize on the momentum from all sectors of the world saying we need to digitalize faster and wider. So our ambition is a big one. We want to be a convening and harmonizing force, not reinventing the wheel, but basically do a few things very well. And I was just sharing with you and our audience today 3 of those main things. The first one is to really devise a new ecosystem of standards and technology enablers that help us get that global language for all supply chain actors to speak to one another and exchange information in a way that is truly seamless, truly end-to-end. And this is going to empower not only the physical supply chain with its shipping, cross-border processes, but also the financial supply chain talking about insurance, trade finance, and all the wonderful use case that can come out of that exchange of information in the supply chain. The second part that we are very focused on is recognizing that we need to modernize the rules for trade. As supply chain becomes digitalized, we need to make sure that local laws as well as industry rules are updated in such a way that they can recognize and support the use of electronic trade documents in the same way that paper documents are recognized everywhere today. And the third pillar, which is equally important, I would say, is actually in that process, making sure that we empower businesses and policymakers to acquire new capabilities, to invest in infrastructures, to invest in training and change management, because we need nothing short of a transformation. And the transformation needs to take place at several levels. At the operational level, let's say at the bank branch, making sure that the operation staff is able to process an electronic bills of lading, an electronic warehouse receipt, in the same way that they accept paper documents, for instance. We need to facilitate change at the organization level, the way that the different departments exchange information and processes, and we need to have systematic change as well between business to business and business to government. So in short, those are the three pillars that really underpin the work of the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, and that's where we are saying we are working on this journey towards that globally harmonized digital trade environment.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks so much. I have a follow-up question for you, and you mentioned the importance of standards. Is there a compendium of relevant standards available to stakeholders in international trade to help them on this digitalization journey?
Thank you, Raul. In fact, that's a question that we get asked a lot at the ICC Digital Standards Initiative, especially in the first 6 months of our existence. So in those 6 months, we had a series of multi-stakeholder consultations, and there are two kinds of questions that we get asked. The first question is, okay, it seems that there are no coherent standards that we can leverage on. Is that true? And our answer to them is no. There are already a lot of existing standards that can be leveraged. For example, if you talk about, let's say, we take that favorite example again, bills of lading, there are electronic bills of lading standards being available. Or let's say if you talk about, how do we standardize legal identity? There are existing standards that have been enforced for a few years. Or let's say we look at legal reform. Are there model laws that countries can actually leverage to shorten that journey? So we get asked this question, and so our answer to them has always been, yes, there are existing standards out there that you can actually leverage. The second question that we get asked a lot is, where do I go and find those standards? And so this is where we start pointing and connecting people to various standards setting organizations, for example, to UNCITRAL, for the model law on electronic transferable records, to, let's say, the Digital Container Shipping Association for the e-bills of lading standard, to GLIFE for the legal entity identifier standards, so on and so forth. And we realized in this process that this is not a scalable way of sharing the information, of empowering people to act on their digitalization journey. And so we look around and try to find a compendium of standards, as the way you name it. Is there an accessible resource that we can put into the hands of businesses, of government agencies, of policymakers to make them have the right information to make the right decisions? And at that point in time, the answer was no, there wasn't such a thing in the market. And so myself and our colleague at the World Trade Organization, Emmanuel Gan, we look around and we say, okay, if there isn't something like that yet, let's go and make one. So that's the reason why you find that we have actually released last month a standards toolkit for cross-border paperless trade.
And sorry, can we go to the next slide, please?
And this is where we have actually strived to provide a practical tool to help market players and policymakers to navigate the standards landscape. So our goal at the onset is not to make a dictionary of all standards available, but to take a very practical step at what are the minimum viable combination of standards that could help set various actors in the supply chain for a success in the trade digitalization journey. So in this pocket guide, which is consciously very compact, it's only 20 pages, and it's freely available from both the ICC and WTO website, you will find standards that we have documented and close to 100 of different standards, frameworks, and initiatives that are readily available for adoption today. So whether you are an exporter, importer, a big size corporation, or a medium, small enterprise, whether you are acting as a forwarder, a carrier, or maybe you are working in a customs authority and want to find out what are the standards that can help me digitalize the cross-border regulatory procedures. There is something for you in this toolkit. And so in doing this, we hope to equip every supply chain participant with some of the most reliable and widely used standards so that we can start having that global language that I talked about at the beginning of our conversation. And hoping that by raising awareness about all the available standards, we will be able to drive convergence among international supply chain actors and to promote genuine interoperability, which is where we have all parts of the supply chain interconnected seamlessly in a not too far future. So the last thing I would share is that since the publication was released 1 month ago, we have received a very good feedback from the market, and because of the wide reach that it should have, we are in the process of translating the original publication in English into 7 other languages, and those are Chinese, Arabic, Russian, French, German, Portuguese, and Spanish. So with these 8 global languages, it is our hope that this toolkit will get into the hands of as many people as possible and help as many actors to digitalize as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And it's good to see that there are a couple of questions coming in on the Q&A. Please feel free to ask questions and we'll get to those towards the end of this panel discussion. Hannah, so you spoke about the adoption of standards, and they're certainly essential to scaling and realising the full benefits of trade digitisation. You also mentioned Malita, and we know that we won't achieve this globally harmonised and digitalised trading environment without an enabling legal environment. Luca, if I can turn to you, why is that, and do we have legislative solutions available?
Thank you very much, Raul. And I would like, first of all, to thank, of course, you for moderating this important panel, but the co-organizers, of course, our colleagues in ESCAP and the ICC in general, and in particular the Digital Standards Initiative. Both of them are very strong partners of Ancestral in the space of digital trade. And we have worked together quite a bit. I have to say there are some very significant achievements there. And this event hopefully will be the stepping stone for more developments to come. I usually say that successful engagement in the digital trade space is the result of 3 components: the sound policy decisions, the robust technical infrastructure, and the enabling legal framework. Now, with respect to the sound policy decision, Hannah was just mentioning that ICC-DSI was established only 18 months ago in response to the pandemic crisis. 18 months later, it's not only we still feel the effects of the pandemic, especially on supply chain logistics, but we have more disruption. So we are moving from a one-off response to a global crisis to the need to have a more resilient supply chain management through digitization in the right way and through very solid and reliable data flows that would accompany the physical flow of goods across borders. So I think that when it comes to the policy decisions, that's clear. When I read in the newspapers that we have all of these problems, for instance, these days with the carriage of goods by sea, problems at ports, problems with ships that have to wait for being loaded and unloaded, and so on and so forth. And my heart goes out to those who have to manually update the related information. So I don't know really, we cannot really say there is no more excuse not to go in the right direction. Hannah has already extensively referenced the technical framework and the increasing availability of open and globally accepted standards. So what comes down to me is actually to discuss the legal standards. And there are several legal standards, of course. First and foremost, especially here in Asia and the Pacific, but not only, the text prepared by the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, or UNCITRAL. These texts, which are usually referred to as texts on electronic commerce, but actually they cover matters such as electronic transactions, electronic signatures, electronic contracting. They have been adopted in more than 100 states in the world. And this is particularly true in Asia and the Pacific, but not only, also in the Americas, also in many parts of Africa. So we are talking here about texts that already are very well known. And we're also talking about the desirability to maintain a high level of harmonization in order to increase legal predictability, reduce transaction costs, and first and foremost, promote legal recognition across borders, which is the gateway to interoperability and data exchange. So this is incredibly important, and I believe that there is a full awareness about this at this point in time, although there is not yet universal acceptance of this approach. But of course, there is a very strong discussion behind, and there is a strong push towards this kind of outcome. Now, you mentioned the Malita, the Model Law on Electronic Transfer Records. This is the solution to a very specific problem. The problem is there are certain commercial documents, which we refer to as transferable documents and instruments, that entitle the holder to payment of money, like a check or a bill of exchange, or to delivery of goods, like a bill of lading or like a warehouse receipt. Now, the problem is exactly that on the one hand, possession entitles to performance, but on the other hand, it's difficult. And in many countries, almost all maybe, it's impossible to think of possession in a digital world. I said almost all because now, of course, there are some well-known proposals to introduce this concept, but many other countries are not ready. So what are the basic features of Malita? Well, first of all, it relies on the 3 pillars of ancestral text in this field. Most importantly, non-discrimination, of course, non-discrimination against the use of electronic means, which means to give legal effect and validity to these documents in electronic form. Secondly, and equally important, technology neutrality. Therefore, the law does not mandate or favor the use of any specific technology. Technology neutrality is really the underpinning of interoperability. So they just go hand in hand. And third, the notion of functional equivalence, that is to say, it sets certain legal requirements that allow to reproduce this notion of possession online. In particular, there are 3 legal requirements where, on top of information requirements, that is to say, there is the issue of control, there is the issue of singularity, and there is the issue of integrity. So with these 3 requirements, which were carefully drafted, it is possible to reproduce possession online. Now, why is it so important to follow functional equivalence? Because functional equivalence allows not to change the existing law. So there is absolutely no need to change the law that, for instance, already applies to bills of lading. And this is very practical for many reasons, including in case there is the need to change medium from electronic to paper. Because imagine if you have to use different rules depending on whether the bill of lading is on electronic or paper form. There are many other features in this model law. And one thing which is maybe particularly interesting is the fact that it was concluded already 5 years ago, but it was already in line with those emerging technologies. So not only, of course, it recognizes that, for instance, an electronic bill of lading will have metadata. It also recognizes that the same bill of lading will include the dynamic information from oracles. So it already foresees the electronic bill of lading as a component, if you wish to call it a smart contract. I wouldn't say that, but I would say in any way the commercial document with automation. That yes, but that's a terminological issue. If you want to market it as a smart contract, please do. And that will capture all of this information that comes from the Internet of Things and will incorporate it so that there is easier supply chain management. These things are already the reality, and we only have to match the legal framework, which is there, which is increasingly adopted, and the practical applications that are also there. The model law is technology neutral, but there is awareness that distributed ledger technology is important. And so there is an explanatory note that provides guidance on how to implement the model law with the use of blockchain, for instance. So you already find there quite a bit of information that can be quite useful in adopting and implementing the model law.
Thank you, Luca. If you Google Malita, you'll find on the UNCITRAL website that explanatory note, which is very comprehensive and goes into a number of issues related to each article. Luca, I think many policymakers and people listening to this session would be interested to know what is the nexus between Malita and the framework agreement and indeed other regional trade agreements. How are they related?
I believe this is actually a most welcome recent development and quite exciting one. For some time in this space, there was a little bit of disconnection in between e-commerce chapters in free trade agreements and regional trade agreements, and enabling legislation such as the one prepared by UNCITRAL, but not only, because of course in other fields there are also global reference models. For instance, data privacy and protection, one can think of the Budapest Convention by the Council of Europe. We have seen a trend, an interesting trend in regional trade agreements. Again, is a trend that starts in the Pacific with the CPTPP, actually, which has a quite comprehensive e-commerce chapter, and where one can find something that was not completely new, but was the first time that it was so prominent, which is the reference to the need to adopt or maintain certain UNCITRAL texts as enablers, as means to implement and realize the benefit foreseen in the e-commerce chapter, so that all the negotiations behind these carefully crafted chapters would actually translate into actual data flows, which is actually the reason why people should negotiate and ratify trade agreements in the end, to facilitate trade. So we have reference there. We have a reference in RCEP, and RCEP, because it's a few years more recent, it opens up also to Malita, among others, because there is a open-ended reference to UNCITRAL texts. Very importantly, we see that in what the experts see as the most advanced formulation of specific agreements in this field, which are the digital economy agreements that are concluded between Singapore and other countries across the world. And there are modules there. And there is a module specifically dealing with paperless trade facilitation and reference to Malita. And then, of course, our dear framework agreement that we are here to celebrate. And of course, tomorrow there will be the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties of the Framework Agreement. The Framework Agreement explicitly makes reference to the principles underpinning ancestral texts. It mentions non-discrimination, functional equivalence, and technology neutrality. And in doing so, of course, it calls for the adoption of ancestral texts in order to pursue. The framework agreement is not technically a trade agreement. It does not have mandatory rules, but it does hint at the way on how to establish a conducive environment for paperless trade. B2G, but I would say B2G thrives in the broader B2B framework. Which takes me to the really important point, that is the documents covered by Malita are extremely important for paperless trade because they contain a very significant amount of data, and that data is of the best quality. So it's complete, it's up to date, it's authentic. And what we really want is to facilitate sharing that data, which is submitted to banks, for instance, which is exchanged among business partners. We want to have access to that data and use it also for submission to public authorities. And we want to have coherence across the paperless trade ecosystem so that there will be no error, there will be no redundancy, there will be efficiency. And that's why it is so critical to adopt Malita to allow the use of those documents in electronic form. The good news is that Malita comes on top of a suite of ancestral texts that, as I mentioned before, have already been adopted by 100 states. So for many states, for all of those 100 states, it will be very simple to put a small add-on to existing legislation, and the policy decisions and the principles are already in the country. It's just a matter of completing the existing framework. You know, to conclude, as I say, we do regular update of the software in our devices. Why don't we do the update of the legal software of digital trade from time to time? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Luca. I love that last point. If I can go back to Hannah very quickly, I want to see if we can bridge the legal and standards aspects to this. Are there elements within the model law that enable the use of standards that you are promoting, Hannah?
Certainly, Raul. As I listened to Luca, just now, I really like the way that UNCITRAL has really been very forward-looking and progressive in devising this model law on electronics transferable records, and in actually looking at how to enable functional equivalence of digital records in the same way that all these paper records are recognized today in international trade across borders. We see that in the UNCITRAL text, and as you rightly mentioned, Raul, there is a link on the UNCITRAL website where everyone can go in and see the clause by clause commentary to get a very in-depth understanding of that very unique model law. But I would like to just focus our attention on Article 12, which I think is really very succinct but very forward-looking, because it talks about the general reliable methods that could be used to ascertain that functional equivalence. And one of the methods that were cited in that Article 12 is actually any applicable industry standard. So there's just those 4 words are extremely important because it recognizes the importance of, making this space flexible and actually adaptable to the changing business environment. So this is a very fast-moving space, and industry standards, as we mentioned earlier, there are already many out there which are readily available for adoption, but there's also up-and-coming standards which are constantly being refined by industry players, with also policymakers making sure that they work end-to-end, business to business, and business to government. So it's really important that we have this particular phrase that was very thoughtfully inserted into the model law in recognition that applicable industry standards will play a key role in actually implementing what the model law is supposed to do. And I love what Luca mentioned earlier. The beauty of the model law is that you don't need to actually change the law, but it just enables whatever works for paper documents to work in the same way, if not better, for digital transferable documents.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Shifting gears now to operationalizing Malita. Kay, trade trust is described as an interoperability framework for the exchange of digital trade documentation. In this context, what does interoperability mean, and how does trade trust support the exchange of electronic trade documents?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the question, Raul. Before I begin, I'd like to extend my thanks to ESCAP, ICC DSI, for allowing me to speak at this or in front of this august audience. So when we say interoperability framework, well, let's answer the why question first. As previous panelists have elaborated, the benefits accrue to two main audiences in international trade: the industry, who are the trade players themselves, and of course the governments, whose role it is to enable such businesses. Now, when we talk about interoperability framework, in a sense, what we're trying to do is to make portable all the documents that are used in international trade. Now, there are really only two types of documents in international trade, and we've classified them into what we call normal documents and what we call transferable documents. Transferable documents are the type that legally confer or legally transfer performance obligations from one party to another. Normal documents are, well, those that do not. When we say interoperability framework, yes, it's making portable across different systems, across those digital islands that Hannah spoke of before. But to do so whilst using technology to assure certain things. For normal documents, we would be using the technology to assure authenticity and source. Source refers to who actually created that document. And for transferable documents, we add on the additional functionality of assuring legally valid performance obligation transfers in compliance to the MLETR requirements. Now, we do so bearing in mind that trade trust is a framework, not a platform. And what does it mean to be a framework? When you look at the types of standards in play, actually standards can be classified into many different types. You've got policy standards, and the Malita belongs in that category. You've got process standards, you've got semantic standards, and you've even got format standards. Now, because all these different areas need simultaneous and coordinated efforts in order to make trade digitalization possible. This is where we have, in the trade trust framework, created different tracks. So if you look at the trade trust framework itself, on the right-hand side of the figure, you can see that the trade trust framework supports commercial applications via the use of or via the provision of software utility or a digital utility that different systems and platforms can integrate and thereby make all the digital normal documents and digital transferable documents portable across each other. Where we come into play is really at the technology, the business, and the policy levels. So for example, when it comes to international standards, We are involved at the United Nations Center for E-Business and Trade Facilitation working groups to create white papers to educate the industry. We're also working on the creation of the software utility that bakes these standards and are are released on open source licensing terms for the industry to use. So in a nutshell, this is a multi-pronged effort to trade digitalization. Thanks, Rahul.
Thanks very much, Kay. I'd like to ask you, what has been the industry and government experience thus far with Trade Trust?
Thanks for the question, Rahul. If I may have the next slide, please. So, as I said earlier, there really are two communities in international trade. Funnily enough, everybody just usually only thinks of the businesses, but we've also got to consider that governments, by virtue of customs border control, by virtue of certification, are all active players within international trade as well. And so with Trade Trust, we've actually had a very good and close collaboration with Australia under the auspices of the Australia-Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, where three agencies, that is the Australia Border Force, Singapore Customs, and the Infocom Media Development Authority, where we came together to prove a few things. First, we proved that the policy could allow the acceptance of what we call digitally verifiable documents. So the normal documents that I spoke of before, they are digitized through the according to W3C verifiable credential approaches. And that is what we term a digitally verifiable document. Of course, we also tested the technology based on these standards, and we managed to achieve interoperability between the Trade Trust reference implementation and the Australia Intergovernmental Ledger system. We used certificates of origin to conduct this POC, and we had participants like the Australia Chamber of Commerce and selected private sector participants as well. And all this gave us the confidence that such digitally verifiable documents really drove a lot of benefit to both the businesses as well as the government authorities that handled them. And if I could have the next slide, please. So let's switch gears to then the other community, which are the businesses. The fact is, we've had a very, very close and very enthusiastic collaboration with many international organizations, the ICC being, of course, one of them, but also many other governments with which we have done digital economy agreements as well as bilateral agreements. Our work with the Port of Rotterdam is also something that we've spent many years on. And more recently, we did work with the Abu Dhabi Global Market, which is also a MLETR-enabled jurisdiction. Now, all this hopefully shows the businesses out there that this momentum is picking up. This momentum this momentum that covers both the legal as well as the business aspects of things is something that will pick up steam, and we hope to drive businesses towards a digitalized future. Thanks, Rahul.
Thank you, Kay. So at this point in the panel discussion, we've heard about the importance and availability of standards for digital trade. We've heard about the need for legal reform, and we've heard about this open source solution in the form of Trade Trust that leverages open standards and Malita, but we haven't discussed yet the many benefits of trade digitalization. I want to turn to Chris Southworth. As ICC United Kingdom Secretary General, you've commissioned several economic analyses that delve into the important question of the benefits of trade digitalisation. How can trade digitalisation benefit us all?
Thanks very much, Raoul, and good morning, everybody, or good day, everybody. I'm very sorry I can't join you in person, but really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It's a real privilege to have this chance to kind of run through. There are so many, just before I talk about economic benefits, if I can just have the next slide, just while I'm saying, there are so many anecdotes that have come up during the whole COVID period that really illustrate the issues that we're talking about here. One of those issues was that title documents are often put on airplanes and fly to their destination ahead of goods traveling on ships. In the COVID period, we were presented with a situation where the aviation industry was grounded. Ships were going from, for example, west to east into the eastern ports, and then finding themselves in a situation where the goods were stuck on the ships waiting for the title documents, which were in paper form, in envelopes and boxes, sitting on aeroplanes, still stuck in airports in the West. And what it really illustrated is just how archaic that system is. It was completely unnecessary. If those documents are able to be in digital form, they can be transferred at the click of a button and arrive at the same time or ahead of those goods coming into port in whatever part of the world that might be. You know, that's the reality we're living and working in within trade. So just going back to the economic case for legal reform, I presented before at ESCAP, so many of you will have heard some of these figures before, but we first of all published a series of business cases around the G7 economies. What was the value of this exercise to the G7, the larger economies, if I can put it like that? And on that slide, you can see very clearly that the value of aligning our legal frameworks to the MLETR framework and removing legal barriers to these important title documents will deliver a 9 trillion uplift in trade growth and importantly, a 6 trillion uplift in SME exports. What's actually perhaps more interesting, at least from my perspective, is the most recent report, which was published by the Commonwealth a few weeks ago, which sets out the case across a wider spectrum of countries. So we knew what the benefits were in the larger economies, and to some degree that wasn't necessarily surprising just because of the value and volume of trade. But what we really needed to prove is this an exercise that will benefit the big economies, or is this an exercise that will benefit everybody? And I think what the Commonwealth report has done is really put to bed the whole argument that this is something for the bigger economies. And so what you see on that slide is some really interesting data, and I'll just explain a little bit, because it also separates this issue around customs digitalization, which is where there's an awful lot of focus and has been a lot of focus since the 2013 Trade Facilitation Agreement, that if we continue just to digitalize customs, that will deliver an $80 billion benefit across the Commonwealth, 54 countries, some of which, of course, are in the ESCAP network. But if we couple that with updating our legal frameworks, and aligning our legal frameworks to the MLETR, then we get this terrific uplift of 1.2 trillion. And you may say, well, why do we get that huge uplift? Well, there's a couple of reasons why. Because the trade economy tends to revert back to paper. If any of the documents in the system, the 27 trade documents or more, depending on what country and transaction you're handling, are in paper form. And those can quite often be the title documents that we're talking about here, electronic transferable records. And it also means that when the system is operating in paper, we can't scale technology solutions. So you can't get that efficiency gain in the current system where we're all operating on paper. And so when you digitalize the whole system, customs and title documents, you get this incredible uplift. And just to put that in context, if you combine the 80 billion to the 1.2 trillion, you obviously get a 2 trillion gain across the Commonwealth countries. That's the equivalent to twice the trade target, the intra-Commonwealth trade target in one initiative. So it dwarfs every other initiative that we're talking about across the Commonwealth in terms of promoting trade. We can achieve that goal with actually relatively little intervention from governments at almost zero cost. We are simply talking about using regulation and legal change as a stimulus for economic growth, and you can see the numbers there. And then across all the business cases now, we've published business cases between us, the ICC and the Commonwealth, covering 60 economies. Those are large economies to small economies, island economies, emerging economies, developed economies. It doesn't matter what part of the world or what geography you're in, the benefits are the same for everybody. That's an 80% cut in trade transaction costs. It's half the trade finance gap, which is 850 billion. And importantly, on cross-border compliance, which can take up an awful lot of time, where documents are toing and froing across border agencies, you can cut that time from 25 days to 1 day, and that applies to everybody. And then interestingly, in the Commonwealth study, it really pulled up the fact that in some economies, particularly small island economies, where transport costs and logistical costs are so high, that in some cases, the cost of trade exceeds the value of trade, simply because the trade costs are higher than the value of goods or services that you're trying to trade. So anything that brings those costs down, significantly down, is a worthwhile activity. And that's another reason why this exercise is so important. So I'd really point you to that Commonwealth study. If you haven't seen it, it's on the Commonwealth website. It'll be on the Digital Standards website as well, but it's well worth a read. It goes into quite a lot of detail. And I think in the ESCAP network, there's a lot of that analysis that will be directly applicable. So if we can just move slides, I'd just like to run through a few takeaways. In terms of, what are we learning from all of this? Well, first of all, the future is a place where systems are open. That's coming out loud and clear. It's part of the DSI framework, but it's also a big part of the conversation on the ground with stakeholders, both industry and governments. It's a world where we can connect systems, where systems aren't to the point that Hannah made earlier. You don't have to be part of a club to be part of a system. You don't have to pay those high onboarding costs to be part of that exclusive club. You can just allow your information to move in a portable form that was raised earlier across the different systems and platforms. And then the approach needs to be a sort of technology agnostic approach. We're not picking and choosing one platform or provider or system over another. We're focusing on the environment in which those documents can move around. And then businesses, wherever they may be, or governments for that matter, can pick and choose whatever solution works. The important point is the information is moving in a standardized format, and then we can extract that data quicker, faster, and able to get that transparency and visibility into the system in real time, rather than ferreting through oceans of documents. Second point is digitalization alone won't deliver the transformation and inclusion that we all want to see. Everybody, I think, agrees that we want to see full transformation of the trading system. But what we're seeing 9 years on from the trade facilitation agreement is not transformation at that scale. I think that's an important point. There's a killer statistic that's been published recently by the EU Commission that despite all the investment and sophistication around cross-border systems and processes, less than 1% of EU trade documentation is being handled digitally. That's an extraordinary statistic when you think about it. If we're not getting that scale in the EU, then it's going to be really difficult to do that elsewhere around the world where those systems are not in place. And I think that points really clearly to this whole issue that we've got to look at customs digitalization, trade facilitation digitalization in hand with removing legal barriers to commercial trade documents so that the whole system can transform. Technologies can come in at scale we can drive that innovation across all stakeholders, and then we'll get that amplification and uplift to the figures that I raised earlier on. A point that was made by our UK Department for HM Revenue and Customs, it's called, was a really good one recently, that the governments are only one actor in the trade system. They don't own the trade system. So customs can influence, they are an actor, but they're not the actor. And that's an important point, because we need to look at the system with all actors around the table, whether you're a financier or an insurer or a shipper or logistics or a customs department, and say, how do we apply these frameworks across the whole system? How do we create the right environment for this documentation to move around the whole system, where everybody can sign up to the same standardized formats? Then we get the scale that we're talking about here. And then the point I made earlier around the Commonwealth, that removing legal barriers actually will benefit lower income economies, smaller economies, much more proportionately than the bigger economies. So in terms of the case for legal reform and alignment to MLETR, that case is actually much bigger in the emerging smaller economies than it is in the larger economies. However, those large economies are vital, because that volume and value of trade will drive change across the system. I'll come to that in a minute. And then I think this point around governments and industry working together on adopting the same common standards is a really, really important point. From an industry perspective, we've got to understand there are multiple government departments here, not one. It's quite often up to 7 departments. That challenge for governments is fairly significant, where government systems, which often don't connect in the same ways as people might think they would, those systems need to adopt the same standards toolkit that Hannah was setting out earlier as private sector stakeholders. So this is a challenge that we all have to go through. We all have to kind of figure out, where do we apply and integrate those standards? But I have to say that that standards toolkit is an absolute game changer. I've seen the reaction on the ground in the UK, both from government and industry. It's answered everybody's questions. What standard do I apply? Where do I apply it in the system, both in government and industry? And particularly for SMEs, small companies who don't have the time to try and figure this stuff out themselves. The toolkit just sets it out really easily. You just follow the guidance framework there, and then you can start to prepare and optimize and get ready. So if I can just move to the next slide, just to give you a sense of, what we think some of the future might look like. In the UK, there's 2 things going on that are fairly significant. One which has happened, which is the launch of the Centre for Digital Trade and Innovation. We launched that 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then the big change is actually the change to English law, which is actually just about to start happening with a new bill, the Electronic Trade Documents Bill, coming into Parliament in the next few weeks, and hopefully coming into force before the end of the year. So we've got the fundamental change to English law that will bring the UK and the English legal framework in line with the MLETR framework. And of course, that has important implications, positive implications for other countries that use English law as an underpinning legal framework for trade-related activities. And then the big question that we've all sort of converged around, both we as industry and also government, is what's the mechanism by which we implement MLETR and the standards toolkit at scale, so that we can actually accelerate the whole process of digitalization. And the truth is, before we launched the centre, there was no mechanism. There was just a sort of disparate group of stakeholders. There are different sorts of forums in different contexts. We've got a National Trade Facilitation Committee in one area. We had other groupings around legal changes, but we had no single mechanism that can bring all of us together under one roof, government and different government agencies, as well as all the different industry actors, to sit down and say, okay, then let's begin the process of really accelerating the next phase of transformation that we want to see. So that it's a coordination failure, actually. The frameworks are there. The DSI has created the frameworks, UNCITRAL has created the frameworks, but we need to think in the future or the next stage as to what's the mechanism by which we can then implement those frameworks at scale. And then importantly, how do we test and pilot? That example of the Singapore-Australia pilot is really, really important because we need those use cases to be able to then illustrate the benefits in practical terms. This is about very, very practical kind of testing and piloting of systems. Digital economy frameworks are not quite the same as a typical trade framework, which we, broadly speaking, all understand, whether it's tariff reductions or other types of trade preferences. Those have been established for a long time, so we understand broadly how that works. In a digital economy situation, it's a bit more than that, because we have to understand what that standards framework is. We have to understand what formats our information is in. We have to start to prepare to connect our systems to other systems so that information can flow around. And that takes some thinking through, and it takes some investment possibly in some cases, and it takes some understanding and grasp of how we achieve that so that we can then get that scale of participation. Because ultimately this is about inclusion, allowing more companies to participate and trade at a cheaper cost, and where that environment is dramatically simpler and faster than we've ever seen before. And then just finally on this point of sustainability, if we truly want a sustainable trade system, which I think we all do, we need to be able to have much more accessible data and information. And that actually is generated much easier in a digital environment than it is in paper. It's almost impossible to track every sort of trade transaction in detail with all this paper that's flying around the system, because somebody has to effectively do that manually. It's much, much easier when that information is held in a digital system, and at the click of a button, you can track exactly whether a product is coming from a sustainable source or not, where it is in the system, and of course, you can demonstrate that to the investor on the one hand, and also to the buyer or consumer on the other hand. And that's going to be increasingly important as we go forward and be able to really get proper visibility and transparency and incentivization into the system so that we can promote a sustainable trading system overall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really like that overview of the Centre for Trade and Innovation. It's definitely a welcome development for the United Kingdom, and I think a model for other countries to follow as well. We'll turn now to Q&A. We've got a number of questions here. I think I'll deal first with the one from Yusra Yolanda de Altarbagia. I hope I got your name correctly. Essentially, how long will be the facilitation of any amendments for any digitized documentation, e.g. for bills of lading and other digitalized documentations related to shipment? I think we can take this as a question that relates to how long is the typical pathway to adoption of enabling legal environments like Malita? If I could turn to Luca to give an answer to that question.
Thank you. Well, of course, the time needed to draft and to pass legislation depends very much on the constitution of each country. We have seen legislation passed in a few months, and we have seen legislation passed in a couple of years. We have seen, and I would like to stress this, there is if someone goes to the Untitled website now, it will be possible to see that 7 jurisdictions have already enacted Malita. But what the website that doesn't say, it cannot say, of course, is what's going on in the background. And I think that it is really important to stress, thanks also to all the good work done by ICC, and especially by ICC UK, there was this major game changer of the endorsement of the Malita framework by the G7 plus actually. which started under the presidency of the United Kingdom and is continuing under the presidency of Germany. Chris mentioned legislation to enable the use of electronic transfer records will be introduced soon in Parliament in the UK. But a similar and parallel process is going on in Germany. Not only that, but Germany already has legislation that is close to Malita or highly compatible with Malita, and needs just to be specified in certain implementing details. In this case, the question is how much time it takes. I believe that it will take altogether maybe 1 year to Germany to adopt this regulation, because there is also a process of customization, and it's easier for those countries that have already adopted ancestral text. In most countries, this can be done very quick, because all the general principles are already there. Another jurisdiction that already has legislation which is highly compatible with Malita is the United States. So this has, sometimes is not said, or is not said as often maybe as it should be, but that's a large economy, of course. But there is one additional element to this. We are here, myself personally, Ancestral, for Asian Pacific, we have a dedicated regional center where we can provide assistance to legislative drafting and accompanying the consideration of the bill, like we are doing, we did for some of the countries that have already adopted Malita. That we can do, and we are happy to do, and it's of course our pleasure, our honor. But there is the other side of it, which is to say, passing the legislation is important, but then there is the implementation of the legislation. That's where really ICC-DSI comes into play. That's where the extremely important work that IMDA is doing in Singapore comes into play. All the things that Kay said about working with Australia and implementing Malita, having some tests, pilots. Australia is a very good example of larger jurisdiction with a strong interest in Malita adoption, which Australia has already adopted all ancestral texts actually, so this technically could be done very quickly. Not only that, but Australian legislation, for instance, on bills of lading, foresees a legislative shortcut, because this legislation may be adopted by way of regulation, doesn't need to go through Parliament. So that's something that once there is, of course, a policy decision, can be done really quickly, but then can also be implemented, because the issue here is, for instance, we can have as many jurisdictions in the Pacific adopting Malita as we want. But if the leading jurisdictions, which economically, of course, in the region where Australia, New Zealand, among others, but also Japan, for instance, also South Korea, also China, unless both jurisdictions will actually adopt and implement Malita, the different business processes, even the software needed to manage with electronic transfer records, will not be developed for very small jurisdictions, for very small markets. It's not realistic to think that for markets where maybe, well, of course, they have a huge interest in paperless trade because they have huge transaction costs on import and export of goods. But the local market is what it is a very reduced in size. And in that respect, please allow me to say that there is also a development component to paperless trade that we have to stress and we forget from time to time. And that we need to bear it in mind that Malita implementation is in our interest, but are in the interest of large economies because it gives efficiency and economic benefits, but it's also in the broader interest because it's a shared asset.
Thank you so much, Luca. I'd like to quickly answer Ravi Janugu's question myself, which was that how do you think ICC will influence governments to adopt standards for instance, Malita and other standards, and most importantly, legalize electronic records? One of the things that we've done is to develop the Legal Reform Advisory Board. It's composed of multilateral development bank participants, industry associations, intergovernmental organisations like UNCITRAL and ESCAP. And one of the chief aims of the Legal Reform Advisory Board is to catalyse technical assistance projects in emerging economies with assistance from multilateral development banks. That's one way in which we're supporting or influencing governments in their adoption pathways. The other is that we're seeking to secure political commitments in various intergovernmental fora to analyse the domestic legal situation and to start on that journey towards adoption of Malita. We have an ambition over the next 2 years to secure political commitments from some 100 countries around the world. And we pursue that through a variety of means. One is the Joint Statement Initiative on Electronic Commerce in Geneva, where we are actively supporting a provision introduced by the United Kingdom and Singapore that calls for the adoption of legislation that is consistent with Malita. If I could turn now to the question from Lee de Dios. Governments are usually worried about the cost of adopting standards. They might need assistance in estimating the costs and the benefits to convince them. Is this assistance available? If I could turn to Hannah to answer this question, please.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you, Lee, for this very interesting question. I would like to address this in two ways. So the first thing to think about when we look at your question, I think it's not only about the cost, but what's the value of adopting standards. And I think earlier Chris has laid out some very compelling numbers. For instance, from the Commonwealth study recently, looking at the various economic benefits that will be unleashed in the entire ecosystem, especially for smaller countries, as we go about this journey of harmonizing a digital trading environment, both in terms of enabling that legal reform needed and also adopting the standards to underline that journey. So I think the value is really enormous, and besides the economic value, which has been quantified and also can be similarly quantified for other countries and regional economic groupings, I think a very important thing to remember, if we were to put the value of trade and supply chain digitalization literally in your hands, and you look at 5 fingers on your hand, I would give you 5 very specific benefits of actually adopting standards in that journey. So the first one really, as has been mentioned a little bit earlier in our conversation today, is really to reduce the trade finance gap, because all this data which is going to be efficiently unleashed from the system will underline a lot of the currently manual processes which take a long time to actually unlock that liquidity needed to support the real economy. So think about, know your customer, know your goods, know your suppliers. All these processes will be a lot more efficient with the data going to be seamlessly exchanged from end to end. So that's benefit number 1. Number 2 for governments would be really to have that visibility of your economy and the supply chain, plugging the VAT gap, which is so much needed, especially as we go about the economic recovery post the pandemic. The third benefit, again, on that hand, is really to empower small and medium enterprises, especially because, as we know, they don't have the resources to deal with the mountains of paper that they currently have to grapple with. And the fourth benefit, which I would give you again, taking a leaf from what Luca mentioned earlier, we would be able to improve supply chain resilience, not only from future pandemics, but also in terms, in times of conflict, in times of supply chain disruptions, which many of our countries around the world are suffering from today. And last but not least, a very important benefit, of course, is by removing the paper, we would be helping ESG objectives, which of course is very high on the agenda. So that's the first way to look at your question. It's not only about the cost, but about the value. And the second part of looking at this question, I would ask you to consider is actually, what is the cost of not adopting standards? And the cost of not adopting standards are very, very large, because if you don't adopt internationally adopted standards, the same as other countries or other sectors of the industry, you risk becoming a digital island unto yourself. And that is not something that we can actually have happened in international trade, because by the definition of international trade, you need something that works across borders, across sectors. So I would leave those thoughts with you, and I think that's a really important question to consider, and that is an equation that I hope is going to be very clear for all policymakers and business leaders as we move along in this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. I'd now like to ask each panelist to give me a 1-minute take-home message. It can be a call to action. It can be the key point that you want to convey to the audience. And if I could start on my left, please, to Kay.
Sure. Thanks, Raul. I would say that the takeaway that I hope that the audience goes away with is that the time is now, right? For both the businesses as well as government authorities to go full bore into trade digitalization, but to do so in a manner that is open, neutral, and based on internationally accepted standards, technical standards or otherwise. Now, in Singapore, we've tried to trigger that via our digital economy agreements with Australia, New Zealand, Chile, most recently UK, to, I guess, marshal, right? Marshal a grouping of like-minded countries to take on this journey, come on this journey, and bring our businesses along and show them that it is easier than it looks. And so, yes, that call to action is what I would like the audience to take away. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kay. The time is now. I like it. If I could turn to Chris over in the United Kingdom, what's your take-home message?
Yeah, I mean, I would build on that. I mean, I think my take home from this is, digitization, as Hannah mentioned earlier, is a journey. And I think we've got to look at the next stage as the next phase of this journey. And my call to action here now is that the evidence is very clearly pointing to maximum benefit when we transform and align our legal frameworks to the MLETR framework at the same time as investing in the digitalization of our trading and customs and trade facilitation systems. So my call to action is look at the evidence. Let's be led by the evidence and the numbers and the analysis, and let's do those activities together, hand in hand. Then we will see that transformational benefit that we all want to see quicker and faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Be led by the numbers. I love it. I'll turn now to Luca Castellani. What's your take-home message, please?
Well, I think there's an emerging consensus when the time is now, but what does that mean? I heard the strong and solid arguments on each and every aspect of this discussion. We have the numbers, we have figures on savings or on efficiency. We have description of technical standards. We have examples, pilot projects, proofs of concept. I would say for logistics, it has been tested many times over, but we have seen it also for trade financing. So everything has been tested and many times over and is ready to go into production. And in some cases, it has gone into production. There is one thing that sometimes you yourself say, Rao, and I disagree with you. You say 0.1% only of bills of lading in the world are issued electronically. It's not true. Those are not bills of lading. It's less than that. And this is very sad because we have everything there. So at the country level, at each country level, what is missing? The champion, the national champion. We need someone who has an institutional interest or even a business interest to go out and say, okay, I have hundreds of pages from ICC, from UNCITRAL, from ESCAP, from saying this is something that should be done now. And I would like to see this becoming true in my country. Because there's about 200 countries in the world, and one has to go after each of them. So my call is with 1 minute is a call to action of those who are now listening to us and sitting in each country and say, wow, this is so wonderful, but how can it come to me? It can come to you. All the people sitting in this panel are so happy to share expertise and resources and lessons learned and so on and so forth. But this will not be useful unless there is someone at the receiving end who can transform all of these into A, legislative action, and B, business implementation.
Thank you, Luca. We need national champions. Are you listening? Are you on the call? That's what I want to know. Thanks so much, Luca. And finally, I'd like to turn to Hannah. Please, Hannah, from the DSI, what's your take-home message?
Thank you, Raul. It's very encouraging to see, all the panelists and also the interactions from the audience today. Very interesting and thoughtful questions from the audience. And I think I feel a lot more optimistic, especially after our event today, because I can see for myself, from the DSI perspective, in the next 5 years, a massive convergence between efforts from policymakers, the business community, the technology service providers, all making things work better than they did in the past 5 years ago. And like Luca mentioned, it doesn't have to be a lonely and difficult journey. All the people that you see today on the panel and all the industry and government partners that we have been working with at the ICC Digital Standards Initiative are here to assist, whether it's the legal reform journey, like what Raul, you mentioned earlier. There are technical assistance available to actually help countries conduct legal reforms needed. There are standards toolkits which are freely available, and many of the standards in that toolkit, I would like to highlight, they are open and free for adoption. For example, the Trade Trust Framework as one instance. And last but not least, I think a very important thing to remember is that we have a global talent pool, which is really embarking into, the next future of work. And many of these people would be looking forward to the future of trade and supply chain in the ways that were not possible before. And all of these are dependent on enabling legal reform, regulations, and business environments which are made possible by policymakers like yourself, sitting in the room and also listening to us from wherever you are. So you hold the key to the future. And again, I would like to echo, the call to action from many of our panelists today. The future really lies in your hands. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their contributions today, and thank indeed everyone for attending this session. I think you've heard 4 very clear messages. The time is now. Let's be led by the evidence. We need national champions. Could they be you? And we're here to help. And when I say we, I mean ESCAP, I mean ICC, DSI, I mean Interoperability, I mean Trade Trust. So with that, let's work together to achieve a globally harmonized and digitalized trading environment. Thank you to ESCAP for hosting us, to our partners at Interoperability and IMDA, and thank you for listening.